President Robert Mugabe was a very power-hungry man who also failed to understand the economics of states. And in the year August 1981, he allowed for Soviet troops to train in Zimbabwe. He then used these troops to suppress his opposition, and it is said at the time between 80,000 to 100,000 people were killed as Zimbabwe transitioned into a one-party state. He then also dismissed the Senate and imposed himself as the executive president of the country. President Mugabe then imposed new economic policies, and one of them was making it impossible for companies to actually fire their workers. He also made it impossible to take money out of the Zimbabwean economy. He also introduced new licensing policies for companies that were then being set up. He then also nationalized a lot of the businesses in healthcare, in education, and most of them became state-owned. Mugabe then increased government payroll by 60%, and he grew an addiction to borrowing. International lenders grew worried, and they warned about what was going on in Zimbabwe. Mugabe then decided to reduce the policies that he had imposed on the economy, and as a result, cheap commodities came in because the barriers of trade had been removed. But at the same time, tax revenues were actually failing. What solution did the government think about? They decided to print new money. It is said that at the time, inflation in Zimbabwe started growing by about 20% per year. By 1996, the new economic reforms were finally starting to pay off. However, because of Mugabe's reckless spending, that is the time the veteran fund ran out. And so, protests broke out in Zimbabwe as retired soldiers took it to the streets to protest their fund. And so Mugabe said, fine, I will pay you guys double what I'm paying the current civil servants. And everybody was like, where is this money coming from? The World Bank was in the process of giving Zimbabwe a loan of $100 million US, and they cancelled the transaction. And how did Mugabe react? He said, fine, if you won't lend me money, I am going to stop paying all of my former debts. He stopped paying his debts, and the Zimbabwean dollar lost almost 75% of its value in a single day. Now, the import bill definitely raised and protests broke out in Zimbabwe, but Mugabe wasn't having none of that bullshit. In the year 1988, Mugabe decided to send soldiers in Democratic Republic of Congo to support a rebel group then led by a gentleman known as Kabila. It cost the Zimbabwean government $6 billion US, and they were cut off from all foreign aid. In September 11th, 1999, a coalition by the civic group and white farmers then formed a movement known as the Movement for Democratic Change. And then President Mugabe proposed a new constitution that would forbid prosecution of government officials and give them a further 2 terms to run the country. He then also proposed redistribution of land from the white minority back to the black natives. At the time, Zimbabwe had a population of 1% of the whites, but they controlled 70% of the land. And so the black communities then rallied and chased away these white settlers and took back their land. But a lot of them didn't know how to run these largely mechanized farms. And so the economy further crippled. Zimbabwe, which was known as the basket of Africa, the food basket of Africa, ran dry and the people faced famine. And so, instead of the government cutting out on their spending, they decided to go with the alternative: print more money. Mugabe was obsessed. Inflation in Zimbabwe then went up 100%. In reality, it is said that it went up to infinity. Low revenues could not even cover for the costs that companies were incurring in providing services. Prices went up even before new money was printed because people had lost trust in the currency. Bank withdrawal limits were imposed because then banks could not produce all the money for the depositors that had given them money. Public services failed, schools, hospitals, because by the time they received money, that money was almost worthless. 95% of the Zimbabwean population became unemployed, and 30% of the population had already left the country by 2006. By 2008, a lot of shelves in supermarkets and shops were actually empty. In 2008, a national unity government was formed, and in April 12, 2009, the Zimbabwe dollar ceased to exist. It was then in the country they used the South African rand, the British pound, and the US dollar to conduct trade. And all this didn't come to an end until 2017, when Robert Mugabe was removed through a military coup and then replaced by his deputy. It is said that at the peak of inflation in Zimbabwe, when writing receipts, they would often omit the zeros because you're writing Zimbabwe trillions on the receipt. So guys, look at what the effect of power-hungry leaders can have on the economy of a country. Understand that the value of a country's economy is based on its exports and its international relations. And so if you put up policies that cripple international trade, you're actually limiting the value that your local currency can have. Zimbabwe is still struggling to come back to its economic glory days. However, it is still a turmoil season. Now, next we shall look at Namibia, because they have actually managed to pay off their whole IMF debt, and we shall understand how.